John, it'd be really lovely to meet you and have this conversation. Thank you so much for agreeing to let it be recorded.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I think I'm more excited because I get to pick your brain in regards to all this, and I've had so many questions in regards to this.
Of course. How about we start a little bit? Just tell us a little bit about you and where you're up to in your career and what's the next step for you?
Right. So I got my full registration earlier this year in March 2024. I took some break after that because I think I really needed that step back. And then I started working as subcontract. I decided to go down the subcontracting or contracting sort of pathway in psychology since July. And I can say I've been working as a fully read psych since July.
And in terms of what you're hoping to talk about today, you mentioned that you've had a lot of kind of job offers and people reaching out to you with various bits and pieces, but you're looking at contracts and trying to figure out what's fair, what's not fair.
Yeah, I think so too. I think what I really want to find out, what is the industry standard? What is not okay? So basically, more importantly, what is not okay? What is sort of the middle ground and how can I negotiate so that it is, because at the end of the day, if I'm doing contracting, it's basically B2B because I'm a sole trader. So how does it benefit both parties rather than just one party? It looks from an employee perspective, and I am working sort of mix of both at this stage.
I'll preface this in the same way that I'd preface these conversations all the time, saying I'm not a lawyer. What I'm hoping from this conversation is you might walk away with some questions or just a little bit of clarity as to what are the things that it actually is worth seeking legal advice, and what are the things that you can just look at and go, yeah, that kind of is the way that it is. Does that sound like a reasonable goal?
Absolutely, yeah.
So you mentioned 4 particular clauses that you've seen in contracts that you kind of, they raised some red flags for you. Did you want to kick off with the first one?
Yes, the one that got me was the non-compete. I actually had no exposure to that when I was doing my internship. And when I read that in terms of, not working in a particular amount of kilometers, this area, that area, for a particular amount of time, it was a bit scary because let's say I'm working in South Yara, right? I live there, I'm renting over there, or I've bought my own property, whatever it is. And then I decide this clinic is not a good fit. If there's a non-compete in that, and what is the expectation? Do I have to then move suburbs? Because if I don't work in that area, how would that work for me? What are the legal consequences of that? And that's what I was thinking about because it felt really unfair.
I don't even think you need to start with apologising and saying you need to leave because it's not a good fit. I mean, there's 100 reasons to leave a practice, and you should be entitled to carry on your trade, regardless of leaving a former practice. That's not an unreasonable expectation. Having said that, if you've signed a contract that says that you've handed over that right, you've really kind of limited your options there. This restriction of trade one is one that I find really challenging because I see both sides of it. I see practice owners who they've had someone walk out and literally open up next door, and that feels really unfair. It feels really problematic for them. They're taking not only referrals and clients, but they're taking GP referrals as well. Me personally, I've never liked restriction of trade clauses. I've always liked the idea of actually doing what's in the best interest of the client and also recognising that the clinician's not going to be there forever. I don't expect that anyone who's worked for me in my practice is going to continue working for me until the day of retirement. And when they do come to leave, I want them to go on and set up, whether it's their own practice or go to the public sector or whatever. My thoughts about this one tend to be that the restriction of trade is not entirely unreasonable. I don't do it personally, but I don't think it's unreasonable, but often the times and the distances are problematic. So often they're in this kind of tiered system. Is that what you've seen in the contracts that you...
That's what I've seen. It's tiered. So if it's not 20, then it's 10. It's not 10, then it's 5. It's not 5.
Yeah.
It's 3. But I think you're right. The starting point 20 for not working for 3 years, that's a very long time.
Absolutely. And I guess my view of that would be, let's assume that we think that a restriction of trade is fair and, fair and legal. And, I don't want to get into the legalities of whether that is fair and legal, but even if we assume that that's reasonable, What would you say would be a reasonable restriction? Because if I grab a map of, you mentioned South Yarra, right?
Yeah.
Let's bring that up on Google. Let's have a look at what 5Ks from South Yarra looks like. Let's have a look at what 10Ks from South Yarra looks like. Let's have a look at 20Ks. When you look at that map and think, okay, I might want to work in the CBD, or I might want to work in Essendon, but is it fair that the practice owner says that you can't work in South Yarra? What would you say is a fair distance?
I think a fair distance would be anything under 5 kilometers. And, again, I've seen contracts where there's difference between just like this is the location and then you have 5 kilometers radius versus just 5 kilometers. And again, I think if it's a radius, it's bigger even. So even that terminology is very interesting. But I think anything like 3 kilometers is reasonable. And I think more importantly, what I've observed is, and this is my personal opinion, that it's not about, I think it's fair for the practice owner to, like, you can't take the clients with you. I think that's fair. Ultimately, it is the client's decision, but it's fair to add that. But the radius is very restricting because for me, it feels like I can't work anywhere else if this doesn't work out. So
I don't think it's fair to say that you can't take it with you. No, I actually think that we as psychologists, our code of ethics says that we need to behave in the best interest of the client. So when you sign a contract that says, I agree to not take my clients with me, if you've got a strong relationship with that client and they are acutely unwell, you've signed a contract saying, I'm willing to put that person's recovery at risk in order to be compliant with that contract. So me personally, I think what I ask, or what I've always asked practitioners to do when they leave, is to talk to each client and say, you can see someone else at this clinic, you can come with me to my new clinic, or I can refer you to someone else outside of the clinic. And I actually think it, in an ethical and professional way, if we put aside the business considerations, we should actually be behaving in the best interests of the client, and that means looking after what they need. So I've always just asked clinicians to ask their clients to make a choice as to where they want to go. I think a restriction of trade that's geographic is fair, but I'd say very small. I'd say a kilometre or 2. And I genuinely, and I know that the practice owners who are listening to this are going to be horrified because they're going to imagine somebody literally opening up over the road. But if I think about where my practice was, and I've worked in 3 different locations, if I draw a line that's a kilometre long, I'm pretty okay. Maybe 2 kilometres long in most circumstances. And by the way, let's just bring up Hobart on the map here. Maybe in Hobart it's 500 metres rather than if we draw that 10 kilometre circle around Hobart, that becomes the whole of the city. So I think some of it depends on where you're working, what the size of the town is. But to me, the restriction should be more like a year or so and more like a couple of kilometres, maybe not the same postcode. This whole idea of writing off entire chunks of a city for 3 or 5 years, that seems both unrealistic and also unreasonable.
And I think that's so true, because just from an early psych perspective, early career psych, I have this, I was reflecting on this feeling of restriction to practice somewhere else, to learn and develop new skills, because I have competing demands between my professional skill set versus the business expectations of the industry. And that's a very, I guess, delicate balance. That's what I've observed.
Oh, I mean, I'm very supportive of practice owners, and I want to see them do well. And it's a hard business to run well, and it's a hard business to make a profit in. So I'm not saying that practice owners are being exploitative there. What often happens is that these contracts get drawn up by a lawyer. The practice owner gets the contract boilerplate from the lawyer and just sticks your name in it without actually thinking about it. Most people, if you actually sat down with a map and a compass and drew that little circle, most people would come to much more reasonable circumstances if they thought about it. They've gone to a lawyer, they trust the lawyer. The lawyer is acting in their best interest in the same way that we act in the best interest of our clients. And they go, right, go for a huge restriction. And I think what that leads to is that when you receive that contract, it does look a little bit kind of one-sided.
That's right. So tell me one thing, Aaron. So how do we early career psychologists, right? How do we negotiate this with practice owners? What would the language look like?
I think the starting point is to just be really clear about it and just say, yep, I like the offer, I like the KPIs, I like the remuneration, I like the client work. I've had a look through the contract, and this restriction of trade clause seems unreasonable. At some point, I'm going to leave. I'm not planning on leaving anytime soon. I'm certainly not planning on leaving, immediately. But if I leave in 10 years' time, according to this clause, which you're asking me to sign, I can't work in Essendon, or I can't work in the CBD, or I can't work in South Bank. And sorry, that's the limit of Melbourne suburbs that I know that are going to be near. And I'm not saying that I want to do that, but at some point in the future, I might. Can we talk about something that's a little bit more realistic in terms of that clause? I'm happy to have my trade restricted. I don't want to open up in competition just over the road from you, but can we talk about some numbers and some distances that are a little bit more realistic? And I must admit, I would view inflexibility around that point as being a bit of a red flag. I think if people are inflexible around their money and how much they're offering and what the remuneration and the KPIs, I really understand that. They've got to make the business model work. But if they're inflexible around the restriction of trade thing, I'd probably look at that as a bit of a red flag and keep going with your application process.
Right. Okay, that's good to hear.
It's very reasonable that the business owner wants to protect their business, but I don't think you need a 10-kilometre, 10-year-long restriction of trade to protect your business.
Got it.
I mean, there is a power dynamic in that they're the business owner and you're the employee or the contractor, but there's also a power dynamic in the other direction in that, the supply of jobs is greater than the number of people looking for those jobs. So you, the applicant, are in a more powerful position than any time that I remember. And I'm seeing a lot of psychologists who are using that to try and negotiate for higher wages. I think and I understand that we're in a cost of living crisis, but I don't think the practice owners are typically sitting on mountains of cash that they can afford to hand over an extra $10,000 or an extra 10%. But issues like this that are minor around the edge of contracting arrangements, I think there should be a lot of room to negotiate.
Wonderful. Yep. Thank you so much for that. That's actually helpful.
We know that finding quality professional development in psychology can be overwhelming. The cost, the time commitment, it's a lot. At Prep, we've been there. That's why we've created this training specifically for you that is affordable and impactful. Our live online CPD program is developed by experienced psychologists who know the challenges that you are facing. Join a community of like-minded professionals and develop practical skills that you can use with your clients today. Visit learning.prep.clinic and discover how Prep can help you to unlock your full potential.
Okay, what was the next one you wanted to chat about?
Yes, I wanted to chat about intellectual property. And how does that work in this industry?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting one, but I really view that there's a difference between intellectual property and then the commercial exploitation of that intellectual property. So, for instance, if somebody asks you to write a PowerPoint that's going to be used for a talk that's coming up at a local school, you might feel really passionate about that PowerPoint and you've put a lot of work into it and you want to protect that intellectual property. And I don't want to minimize anybody's effort, but from a business point of view, that piece of intellectual property is basically worthless. Now, having said that, let's talk about commercialization or exploitation of that intellectual property. Now, if I ask you to take that PowerPoint, design a learning management system around it, do some marketing so that we get 100 people who click on it every day who are going to pay $20 to access the content in that. That's a different thing. That's actually commercially valuable. So in psychology, we often think about protecting our ideas, but I really want to differentiate ideas are a dime a dozen. I have 100 ideas a year. There's a difference between having an idea and then putting the time and energy and money sometimes into turning those ideas into a viable business model. So often when we're negotiating intellectual property, business owners and psychologists are coming from a different point of view. Psychologists are often wanting to protect their ideas. And again, the idea in that PowerPoint or the idea in the talk often doesn't have that much commercial value. Whereas if the practice owner invests $10,000 in developing that website, getting marketing advice, branding it, making it look pretty, etc., that's the bit that they want to protect. So I think probably the starting point when you're negotiating intellectual property is to figure out what are you actually talking about. Often it's not even worth fighting about that much. But if the practice owner is talking about, hey, I'm investing a lot of money into developing an idea into a commercial product, then I do understand why they want to protect that.
I think that's helpful. So what it sounds like to me is there's I think two different things happening. One is like we're talking about like notes, case file reports versus if let's say I'm a contractor and I create something and then the business owner is using that, putting in the money to make it a commercialized product. I think they're two separate things. And like with the notes and reports and all, to be honest, it's a bit of a gray area, right? Who owns it? I think anyways, the practice owner owns it, right? If you're
well, that really depends on the contract. So again, if we talk about things like client notes, if you talk about them as intellectual property, and typically I'd like to see client notes treated separately in a contract because I think that's a different thing. But if you do include those notes as intellectual property, again, we hit a point where the code of ethics and the contract might actually be at variance, because from a code of ethics point of view, you own the notes. Having said that, that's not always going to be the case. Certainly if you work as an employee, and again, conscious of not giving legal advice, but typically if you work as an employee, those notes will belong to the practice. But let's separate out the clinical stuff, and then I guess we're really talking about kind of invention. And often the kind of things that you invent, it's a PowerPoint, it's a blog, it might be like we're doing here, a quick YouTube video. And those things, they often don't have a lot of value, whereas a training product does, or something that is more likely to have that commercial aspect to it.
So what it also sounds like to me, and this is something that I'm learning while I'm moving across, is like, and correct me if I'm wrong here, so let's say I sign a contract in which there's intellectual property, there are different notes, everything's defined, and then let's say along the way, me and the practice owner, we come up with this amazing product idea, right? So we can even amend the contract in terms of adding a new clause, right? That can be done as well. So is that correct?
Absolutely. And again, don't want to give legal advice, but what I would probably say is that the starting point is just to talk to the practice owner and say, let's imagine you and I work together on, my PhD was on insomnia, and, I would like to do a series of talks on insomnia, and I think there's a market there for that. I'd like us to look at that as a business proposal separately to the intellectual property. Because if the practice owner is interested in that and they want to support you, and they think there's a good business case and they're happy to buy into that business for you, then I think that's a legitimate thing that the two of you could do together. But they might also look at that and go, that's not core business for us, our money's tied up somewhere else. And in which case, yes, you should have the right to go off and do that on your own outside of the practice. So I think the starting point is have a chat to the practice owner and say, what do you actually mean by this? Let's imagine I write a blog. When I leave, does that blog stay on your website or will you delete it? Let's imagine that we write a training package together. Let's imagine that we come up with a great AI application for, scoring tests. And you think that that's got commercial applications. How we're going to deal with it. So I think talk to them and have some of those hypotheticals and think about what you would be happy with.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. And I think that's where, if you're very innovative and you like business approaches like this, right? It's good to take legal advice in terms of what do we work around this, because I think it becomes very complex very fast.
Yeah.
And keeping that separate from that, right? Yeah, that's what
And thinking about, because again, I think there's a difference between what you do in the normal course of your work versus what you paid separately. So if you were working in my practice and you developed a new template for keeping your notes, largely speaking, that's yours.
Exactly.
But if I said to you, I've got a $10,000 budget and I'd like to give you that $10,000 because at the end of that $10,000, I would like you to deliver a training product with PowerPoints and videos and all of the other things. I would like to commercially exploit that material, and I'm kind of hiring you to produce that thing using your skills and expertise. So
that looks different, right?
That's a very different business model in my eyes, which again, it's why the contract is black and white, but it's really having the conversation with the business owner and understanding what is their intent.
That's right. That's very interesting. Yeah.
What was the third one that you wanted to flag?
Third one was clawbacks or training repayments.
What have you seen?
So what I've seen is provisional psychologists sign contracts saying that they get free supervision while they're interning, but they have to work, once they're fully registered, they have to work for a certain amount of time, usually 1 or 2 years. If not, then they have to pay all the supervision amount back.
I'm really torn on this one because in a lot of industries, that's really normal. A lot of accountants or accounting firms, they'll sponsor you through your CPA. A lot of law firms will sponsor you through your articles, and the expectation is that you're kind of indentured for a year or two or whatever it is. My problem with that one, even though it is very standard in other industries, it hasn't typically been standard in our industry. And one of the problems that I often see that people have when you go to a law firm or an accounting firm, they're often quite well known and established, and you can look them up and find out what their culture's like. And, you know that if you get a job at Freehills, you're going to work really, really hard, and you're going to have phone calls at 10 o'clock at night and expectations that you're going to be on a phone call at 6 a.m. The next morning, and that's what you're signing up for. If you don't want it, don't go and work for them. Go and work for a smaller firm. In our industry, I've seen a lot of typically registrars and provisional psychs who are in a practice that is fairly shambolically run. It's a bit of a disaster. It's bordering on unethical. It's certainly, that superannuation's not being paid. All of these quite real indicators of poor business. And then they're thinking, hey, I want to get out of here. And they're looking at a $15,000 bill or a $20,000 bill.
Yeah.
So I understand the desire of practice owners to want to protect, because training a psychologist, it is going to cost them $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. I understand the desire to protect that. I just wish that more practice owners would move in the direction of protecting their investment by making their practices the kind of places that people want to stay, rather than try and legally lock people in. So I would be very reluctant to sign those sort of clauses, unless this is a great practice. I've got friends who work here. They've got a really good reputation. The practice owner has a reputation for fairness and, everything's above board. Maybe under that circumstance, you might feel safe, but there's a lot of movement in the industry at the moment. People they're going somewhere, they're not liking how they're being treated, and they're looking at leaving 9 months, 12 months later. And if that's a real possibility, then I think you've signed the contract, and it's very hard to wiggle your way out of those contracts. I've certainly talked to a lot of junior psychs who are, not only do they have their HECS and all of the other cost of living crisis, they're now repaying this quite exorbitant training fees. So proceed with caution would be my strong advice on that. I don't love those clauses at all.
Yeah, and I think one thing what I've observed is the psychs who sign that are usually provisional psychologists. Yeah. Provisional psychologists don't have much options. It's very expensive to be in training as a psychologist because the pay is not that good anyways. There's so many responsibilities. So there's that level of vulnerability, and it almost comes off as just like provisional psychologist is vulnerable. Okay, let me put this contract sort of a thing, and that doesn't go well with the ethics in terms of, there needs to be flexibility or just simply charge the psychologists, provisional psychologists, the fees.
Yeah. If you do sign one of those contracts or you are willing to take one of those risks, I'd probably really make sure that you have at least an external secondary supervisor, because if everything goes pear-shaped, which it might, you might still be obliged to pay the money. You might not be able to get out of that clawback clause in the contract, but at least you're not going to lose your registration, because if the supervisor is also the business owner, and that's being held over your head as well, and I'm not suggesting that practice owners are terrible people who would do that, but sometimes this stuff is going on in your mind more than in reality, and you're feeling like, hey, I've got to stay in a practice that I'm really unhappy with because otherwise I'm not going to become a psychologist. I think making sure you've got at least one person external who's in your corner, who will help you out there, I think is just really wise.
That's actually really good advice. Yeah, that's reasonable. Like having some objective, almost an objective perspective. So do you think having the clawback, the clawback clause in the contract is one of those sort of unethical red flag? Is it on that category, or it's something you can negotiate?
Again, I would go back to, I don't think any of these clauses are necessarily a red flag, because we're not lawyers, right? Most psychologists, most practice owners are acting in good faith, and they go and talk to a lawyer and say, I'd like you to write me an employment contract, or I'd like you to write me a subcontractor contract. And the lawyer, they do their job, and their job is to protect their client. We trust the people who we employ to give us advice. So when a lawyer gives us advice and they write that contract, that's what we think is normal. So no, I don't think it's a red flag that it's there, but I think if the person's not willing to have a conversation about it, I would see that as a real red flag.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Yeah. So I think out of this, it comes, what the main theme of it is just being able to just make sure that you go through the contract, like I'm talking about from my perspective, and having those conversations of what you think is fair for you in terms of your context and your current situation. And you having a conversation with the person you want to work with or work under.
That's how I'd view it. Yeah. You mentioned one more.
Yes, I actually wanted to discuss the payment terms. So working as a subcontractor for the first time, what I realized is the delay in terms of getting your payments once you submit your invoice, and so it's okay if it happens one time, but if it's a pattern, how do we negotiate that? In terms of, how do we negotiate that with the practice owner? Because what I'm observing is with a few of my peers, the same thing. There's a delay in the payment, but when you're working as a subcontractor, you need the money coming in because there's no other source of income, or there's no leave.
When you say can I just unpack that a little bit? Like you submit an invoice and then it's paid 2 weeks later, or they agree to a date and then they don't make that date?
That's the one. Agree to a date, but non-match date.
I would actually view that, again, I'm not a lawyer, but most contracts that I've seen, typically they do it in one of two ways. They'll have payment terms either written as a clause, or they'll say, refer to Annexure A or Index B or whatever, and that annexure will typically say what the percentage is and how often it will be paid. And typically it'll be something like, if you get your invoice to us by the 5th day of every month, we will get your payment to you by the 10th day of every month.
That's right. Yeah.
Practices who fail to meet that, there's really only two reasons for failing to meet it. One is that you don't have enough money in the bank, you've got a cash flow problem, or two is that you are disastrously disorganized and chaotic. And both of those I would view as major red flags. I would say in 12 years of running a practice, I've paid people late 3 times. The first time, and it was super embarrassing, it was in the first 6 months, and we'd just taken on a couple of contractors, and we'd also just got hit with a tax bill, and we'd just grown a little bit too fast, and we didn't have enough money aside. So we were waiting for next week's money to pay off the week before. And like that, I felt terrible about that. And people were paid like 48 hours late. They were due to be paid on the Friday. They didn't get paid until the Monday. So we really changed our entire business model based on that, to just make sure there was always a cash reserve. And then the other 2 times were just literally that I think our practice manager or whoever was doing the reconciliations, like they got COVID, or, they were super sick. Invoices came in, they didn't get around to them until a couple of days late, and we sent an apology to everybody. And I think it was Rebecca, my wife, rather than me, but one of us kind of went in there and just did the pay run ourselves and made a whole bunch of mistakes, and then had to get our practice manager to come back and fix it up later. But there's really only those 2 excuses. It's either disorganized or it's that there's cash flow problems, and I would probably view that as a fairly significant red flag, because if there are cash flow problems, maybe they'll get sorted out. But if they don't, and the business just closes, and you walk into work one day and you see a sign on the door saying, East-West Psychology no longer works here, your chances of ever getting a final payment are just about 0.
Wow.
I would certainly, if the practice owner is not paying you routinely, if it happened once or twice and there's an apology and there's an explanation, different thing. But if it's happening every month, I would be having a conversation about what is the story here. Because if it's poor processes, that needs to be fixed. If it's cash flow, that also needs to be fixed. But I think I'd probably want some pretty clear communication from the practice owner as to what's their plan to solve this problem.
Right. Okay. Got it. Yeah. And what would that conversation really look like? Because it will be very nerve-wracking. Talking about money is very nerve-wracking for most people.
Well, I guess the starting point is that it's a contract, right? The contract, if you're a subcontractor and the contract says, if you get your invoice by the 5th, I get paid on the 10th, or whatever the numbers are, that person is actually in breach of that contract if they're not doing it. So I would probably start by saying, hey, we've got a contract here that I'm meant to be paid on, 2 days ago. That hasn't happened yet. This is the second time that's not happened. What assurances can you give me that this is not going to happen again? Because I can't talk to my landlord regularly about late payments. I can't talk to my bank regularly about late mortgage repayments. This needs fixing. I actually, of all of the things that you've raised, that one to me actually concerns me the most. I do think we're heading into an era of small businesses having financial distress and some of them being insolvent. And I think that's going to be really risky for practitioners, both in terms of their notes, but also in terms of their payments and superannuation and all of the other things that might be tied up in the business.
Got it. And Aaron, where would you draw the line with this late payments? Where would you think would be like enough is enough and I need to sort of make a decision of what to do next versus how much more do I pursue?
I heard from a registrar a little while ago who not only was not getting paid on time, but also the practice owner was routinely walking in and showing off the multiple $1,000 handbags that they had and the talking about how expensive their car was and the renovation that they were doing on their kitchen, etc. That to me just speaks of poor values. I think, your bills get paid first, your practitioners get paid first. I would always pay a practitioner before I would pay myself. And I've certainly done that some months on end in the early days of the practice. The practitioners have done the work, they get the money. Yeah, I don't have a lot of tolerance for practice owners not paying their bills. I think a little bit of latitude based on the fact that we're all human, and being reasonable there it's not a big ask, but I think if this is a pattern, I'd view that as a real, maybe it's time to look for an exit strategy.
Got it. And that's right. I think what it sounds like to me, it's not only just the late payments, but also having that communication with the contractors in terms of why it's late or something's not, and having that and that does ease the anxiety quite a bit and builds trust. And if I think that's missing, then it really, it can be really confusing.
Thank you so much for agreeing to be recorded, because honestly, the questions that you're asking, don't feel embarrassed, because I get asked these questions all the time. It's one of the reasons that I agreed to do this video, because I'm hoping that this will save a bunch of people from, paying for expensive supervision.